Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to see you here again at the IWM. And it gives me a particular pleasure, and it's a privilege to welcome Ivan Vejvoda, who is the new permanent fellow at the Institute. There is not a little irony in this, because I think most of you in the room know Ivan longer than I do. So to introduce Ivan Vejvoda to you is more than carrying coals to Newcastle, but I would very much like to do that for two reasons. It's a pleasure to have Ivan join the IWM team. And of course, this gives me the opportunity to say a few words about his new program, which is also being launched today. So he's joined us not only, as I mentioned, as a permanent fellow. He will be directing of a new research program on Europe's futures, which will be a major new initiative about to start with its very first workshop tomorrow. So I welcome all of you to the workshop who have come to join us in this enterprise, and this is going to be the first of many meetings here at the IWM. And I would also like to take the opportunity to especially thank the Erste Foundation, with the support from the Erste Group Bank, for funding this new initiative of ours. As you well know, before Ivan moved to us from Washington, D.C., and I think he got away politically at a very good time across the Atlantic, and he was prescient in this. He knew exactly when it was time to leave. And of course, you know, their loss is our gain. He was Senior Vice President for programs at the German Marshall Fund in the US. Before that, from 2003 to 2010, he was the executive director of the GMF's Balkan Trust for Democracy, a project which was dedicated to strengthening democratic institutions in Southeastern Europe. The new project which he has will, of course, build on these experience of both, not only of his work in the civil society sector, but also his work, distinguished record of service in the Serbian government as a senior advisor on foreign policy and European integration to two prime ministers. He's also served as the executive director of the Belgrade-based Fund for an Open Society from 1998 to 2002. But it will also draw a lot, the new program, on Ivan's second life, which is outside of the world of policy, and that is his life in academia. He has held several distinguished professorships in several European countries, and I very much hope that the return to IWM will give him the leisure to come back to not only reading books, as he has always been, but writing them again. And with that, let me just mention a couple of titles of books which are probably best known to you. Democratization in East and Central Europe. This is the book he edited with Mary Kaldor. And of course, the book on Eastern and Central Europe, I think, let me get the title right, Yugoslavia, and After, a study in fragmentation, despair, and rebirth, co-edited with David Diker. He's published widely on questions of civil society, on totalitarianism, on democracy, democratic transitions, and post-war reconstruction. Interestingly, it's not about a transition to democracy at the moment, but I think what we are witnessing are transformations of democracies, and the project on Europe's futures will, of course, address that as one of its issues. It will bring together academics, members of civil society, and people from the policy world to discuss here together at the IWM and in institutions close to us on various trajectories for Europe's futures. Let me, without much ado, give Ivan the word, and thank you very much for agreeing to open your own workshop.
Thank you very much, Shalini, for those warm words. And this is really a very special occasion in so many regards, because it is my first public lecture here in Vienna. I've appeared as a moderator and as a discussant here on this panel. But as many of you know, this was supposed to be held on the 29th of June. So with a delay of about 3 months plus, I'm here. My very good friend and one of the many responsible people that I'm here with my wife Spomenka in Vienna is Ivan Krastev, who said about the delay, well, you can actually frame the talk in saying, well, you survived a serious health crisis, so Europe will obviously also survive. And I guess that's a good message of this. I would like to recognize Dr. Erhard Busek, who is at the reason why I'm here, because he brought me to Vienna in 2005 by making me a member of the Kuratorium of the newly founded private foundation called the Erste Stiftung. And it is because of those 12 years of coming to Vienna that somehow it then became the reality that we're living here now. I would like to thank, as Shalini did, the Erste Foundation and the Erste Bank, because they are the generous supporters of this project called Europe's Futures that we are putting together, and this is the initial phase of it. And we will be drawing up a full-blown 3-year project that will look at the challenges that Europe has in front of itself, both internally and externally. I must admit to you that I'm very excited and emotional about this. I haven't been in a long time. Feels like passing a diploma exam, even at this late age in life. But I think it has to do with really the greatness of the challenge that stands in front of us as individuals, societies, and states, and Europe as a continent. Some of you may know that I come from a country that used to be called Yugoslavia, and that as Europe was living its miraculous moment, its annus mirabilis in 1989, when everybody was in the East, in the communist East, returning to Europe, in the famous phrase, there was a country that decided to go the other way, the complete opposite direction. And it became, after dramatic, tragic circumstances and conflicts, a country that became 7 countries today. And so I think this is in a sort the backdrop of what we are confronting here, namely that, which is normal in human, I think, nature, to think and remember only the good things. But I think we have to remind ourselves and constantly keep in mind whether we're just citizens, concerned citizens, academics, policymakers, politicians, of the fact that the dark times can always return. And Europe and the world, of course, have been in many dark times. And my message and my feeling is, because of what we are and what we represent, both as an institute, as people who are passionate about the world, passionate about liberty, passionate about equality, passionate about a just society that is the backbone of modernity that we have been living. That is why I think this is something that is worthwhile contemplating. And as you know, the year 2016 was very much about doom and gloom. I lived in Washington with my wife until January there. As Shalini says, we sort of serendipitously left at a moment when Donald Trump became president. But we lived through a time where we saw America becoming something different than those of us who are Europeans always have America as a kind of model of society, with all of its shortcomings, and God knows that there are many. But coming from the former country and the present country where I am, and thinking about what is happening today in Spain and Catalonia, I often, because of this awareness of history, which I think there's too little of today, the city called Belgrade, which used to be the capital of the former country Yugoslavia, now the capital of Serbia, one crosses the river Sava maybe 2 to 3 times a day. And I often pinch myself because this was such a hard European border for several centuries between the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And yet many people, when they cross the river in their bus or trams or their cars, forget that basically this was an uncrossable border. We went for the weekend with my wife to Brno this weekend, the Czech Republic, and you cross the border and you barely notice it. There are dilapidated buildings, there are no policemen there, and you realize that a border where there were tanks, where there were landmines, personnel mines, basically another hard border that has disappeared. And yet there are people who want to come back, it's called renationalization, to a kind of sovereigntist mode in which they think that by closing in to one's own borders, being with one own on one's own territory, whatever that may mean in a social and political imaginary, is the solution to the problems that they feel. And the external challenges that, of course, and internal ones are defined by today's really negative effects that globalization has had, the sense of inequality that people feel. Perceptions, of course, are realities, whether they're true or untrue in fact. The fear, the simple fear that people have about tomorrow because of the digitalization, because of the robotization. Headlines in newspapers over the past years in Europe would say that about 50% of jobs can be replaced by machines of one sort or another, obviously create a fear of the future. Whether one has a job, one asks oneself, will one ever have a job again? Or those who do not have a job, will they be in the capacity to be offered a job in the future? And that goes along with the question of growth. Will there be growth of the type of growth that we saw before the financial crisis? This is something that stirs the minds of a world which in the corporate and management world is called the VUCA world, the VUCA world, a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In more classical political terms, Machiavelli would have called them tumultuous times. Times where challenges are confronted and societies do not have the answers to what this humongous series of challenges is posed. Europe has had the leisure of living in peace for a number of decades, unprecedented in its history, nearly 7 decades. And yet we need to mitigate this picture because that was not totally true, depending on what you mean by Europe. Is it just the 6 founding members of the Rome Treaty, which was 60 years ago, to remind ourselves, or the countries of the Marshall Plan that celebrates 70 years this year? And I say that because there were very tumultuous times for a number of European countries. 3 of them, of course, went and were under fascism for a long time: Portugal under Salazar, Spain under Franco, and of course the Greeks under the dictatorship of the colonels, emerging in what was called that first European transition that our friend Philippe Schmitter wrote about and his colleagues, or the fact that 2 European countries literally next door, Hungary, invaded in 1956 by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact troops, and then another country just a few kilometers to the north, Czechoslovakia, then invaded by the Soviet troops. So Europe was not all that calm, even though the European Union itself was a budding, successful peace project. I mention this also from a personal point of view because I came of age during the invasion of Czechoslovakia. It made me look at Europe and the history of Europe and what was Europe's futures in a different context, because I knew that the dark times could come back, even though being an optimist by nature, now a very tempered and cautious optimist after what happened to my country and to what we lived through in the 90s in former Yugoslavia, is one that needs to always remind oneself about what can happen. In preparing for the lecture, of course, I went back to look at a number of books. One in particular here, a conference held in 2006. Krzysztof Michalski, the former founder and renowned rector of this venerated institute, edited a volume, What Holds Europe Together, and a number of people were part of that conference. And in the introductory page, Krzysztof writes, the EU in 2006 is facing its greatest challenge, perhaps its greatest thus far. A growing diversity of new incoming members, confronted with the challenge of a unity of a more demanding kind. How will these countries of the post-communist era integrate? And Tony Judd, 10 years earlier, in his book, The Grand Illusion, is it possible that Europe will actually live up to its ideal of a ever united, ever stronger union? And of course, talking about the positive effects of the European Union has a very skeptical view about what Europe will be actually able to deliver on this front. Just 3 years ago, our colleague Ludger Hagedorn gave a lecture here, Europe After the End of Europe, in February. Ivan Krastev just published an excellent book, which I recommend, called After Europe. We had James Kirchig here from Washington, who wrote a book about the end of Europe. And Joschka Fischer, for example, wrote an op-ed, as did Carl Bildt last year. Is this the end of the West as we know it? Is this the end of Europe in the geopolitical terms that we mean? It is undoubtedly the fact that Europe, in a global sense, is using relevance if you look at the projections on demography, on economic strength with the rising Asia and a rising China. And of course, with Europe's incapability to, put it colloquially, get its act together on a common security, defense, and foreign policy, in spite of the challenges. Just take the Syrian crisis, this kind of ostrich policy of putting your head in the sand and not realizing that what is in the immediate neighborhood, namely Syria, hoping that it will go away and that it won't affect you, blows up in your face in the guise of a dramatic migration crisis. Not so much the numbers, because we talk about the 1 million people that came into a country of 80 million called Germany. It was really the suddenness, the concentration of the movement of so many people at one time. And of course, this is something that people have felt as an imminent danger, compounded to what I mentioned before, the nefarious effects of globalization on their daily lives, the bleak outlook on the future, actually the fear of that future, and again, as Ivan Krastev has so eloquently talked about, the demographic fear, the fact that many countries in this part of the Eastern world are feeling the question, are fearing the question, will we exist in 100 years? Will our languages exist? Will someone be able to read the poetry of these languages? And even though this will not happen, this disappearance of peoples and languages in our lifetime or in the lifetime of our children or even grandchildren, it is a fear that compounds with the ones that we have been talking about. And this, in addition, one needs to add to the fact of the loss of trust in institutions, in the loss of trust in the elected officials that don't seem to be accountable and that don't seem to be able to deliver on what the people wish, i.e. a more secure, stable outlook and a daily life that meets their immediate needs. The European population is small and losing, and yet there was a self-satisfaction in Europe, thanks in great part to the fact that, again, as the saying goes, it was a fair weather construct that was able to develop and to flourish under the US security umbrella. The US took care about defense, security, and military issues, and Europe had the leisure to expand, to strengthen its institutions, to find a model in which the bad, dark times of European history would not be repeated by way of an institutional framework that would provide the mechanical, institutional, legal cushions to conflicts that may appear. The tectonic shifts that have occurred have, up until now, demonstrated that those institutional mechanisms have cushioned as best they could the various challenges that have occurred. The test is a permanent test. There are no situations in which one can say we have reached a near to ideal state or a least bad state of institutional affairs. And Europe now is going through a reconsideration of all of its mechanisms. Some are more aware of this, others are simply trying to maybe fudge it, or as the saying goes, to hope to muddle through as best they can. The fact that Brussels is perceived as the scapegoat, as the reason for what is going on, is something that is typical of an evasion tactic, because it has been easy for national governments simply to blame Brussels for whatever went wrong. And of course, the United Kingdom has been the best at this for the past 20 years through its politicians and its tabloids. And now we are seeing the after effects of that. As our colleague Caroline de Gruyter, a Dutch journalist, said in a recent speech, which I recommend in the Netherlands, is that actually 2/3 of the decisions in the European Union are made actually by the prime ministers and presidents, not by the Brussels bureaucracy. And thus there is a lack of leadership and statesmanship in European capitals to explain to the citizens what this is about, that namely they elect their prime ministers and presidents and governments, and then these in turn sit in Brussels in their name. And there is no, or very little, of an alienated bureaucracy. But of course, as you know, the image is completely reverse, that alienated bureaucracy in Brussels is actually the one that we need to blame all the ills that we have here in front of us. I want to read you a little passage, and I know that this is absolutely a no-no in public lectures, but I think it sort of grasps the kind of challenge that we are up against and demonstrates what I would like to underscore as a fundamental message of this talk, and that is very simply, we have been here before through various historical times, that we have suffered, we have paid enormous prices in human lives and in societal and economic development, and yet ultimately we have come out of it. How have we come out of it? Well, because concerned people had the courage, the statesmanship, or very simply the civic courage to stand up and fight for the rights for a better and more just society. The quote is from a book on Stefan Zweig by George Prochnik, The Impossible Exile, Stefan Zweig and the End of the World. So this is a little bigger than the end of Europe. It was a book written 2-3 years ago, again, which I recommend, and it's fascinating. And one of the reasons that I quoted, of course, it's also about Vienna, the city where we are. Prochnik writes about Zweig. The explosion of creativity in early 20th century Vienna is often depicted as a kind of beautiful dream. A rose fire glowed at the last hour of European civilization before some primal savagery reared up and extinguished that renaissance. Yet there were murky overlaps as well between the realm of the flowering spirit and the clenching fist. Rather than a binary opposition between good and evil there, Zweig's story reveals ways that the two sides were fatally interlocked. The artists and intellectuals in Vienna were grappling with many of the same problems and same aspirations that fueled the violent passions of their arch-enemies. Just as Hitler's agenda was dominated by pan-Europeanism in the Napoleonic sense, to be achieved through conquest and maintained through the hegemonic rule of one nationalist culture, Zweig's program was inspired by the dream of pan-Europeanism on a humanist model to be achieved through peaceful, transnational understanding and ruled by an elite assembly of scholars and artists. People on both sides of the cataclysmic debates over Europe's destiny were educated in the same stultifying school system, shaped by the same sinister admixture of sexual repression and jingoistic militarism. They'd passed through the same faith-obliterating war, World War I, and lived with the lingering socio-economic devastations of that conflict. The inspiring, cultured Viennese shared more of their nemesis' concerns about the future of Europe and the need for a profound spiritual rejuvenation than we have yet reckoned with. And I would like to now quote Bronislaw Geremek, who was part of this conference that Krzysztof organized, in a book, an interview book that was done by Lucio Caracciolo in 1992, where it's a conversation between Ralph Dahrendorf, Geremek, and François Furet. And Geremek basically says that totalitarianism, European totalitarianism, is part of Europe. It was created on European soil. It came from European minds and people. And that if we do not build this into our understanding of Europe, not only the flourishing, intellectual, cultured Europe, then we are not really serious about ourselves. And thus, he warns in the first pages of this book of interview that we must bear that constantly in mind, even when things are going very well for Europe, because that can return in its worst fashion. And we have seen, with the rise of populism, with the rise of nationalism or renationalization, with the ugly head of forms of fascism rearing their head again, that this is actually possible. And of course, this is not the same Europe that it was in the 20s or 30s. This is not the Europe of the 19th century. It is a Europe that has developed the mechanisms that I mentioned within the European Union and that are now being put to a huge test. And these grievances of the people who have voted for Alternative für Deutschland or for Marine Le Pen's Front National, or who are likely to vote in Italy's election or in the Czech election that is coming up, or in a Hungary, are real grievances. People are asking for something, not feeling that they are being responded to, and that politicians need to think long and hard. Emmanuel Macron and his victory have given us a sense of what it means to go out there and give a message of optimism and a message about Europe. Early days for President Macron, but a huge new energy that has awoken, one in which he is launching a variety of ideas. We'll see what comes of them. The big question is, will he find a partner in the future German government, which is being negotiated now? But definitely the two sides are aware that if they do not step up to the plate in a very serious manner, the whole project is endangered, and we are looking possibly at a very dire situation in every sense of the word. It is, though, interesting that the year 2016 was the doom and gloom year with Brexit and with the election of Donald Trump, created a kind of awakening in Europe, and a number of opinion polls that were conducted after these two events showed a reawakening of support for Europe across the board in all the member states. I think this is very revealing of a situation in which people confronted, taken out of their slumber, taken out of their cozy feelings of security, realize what it would mean not to have Europe, the cost of non-Europe, and start thinking about the various things that would be lost, and start thinking actually about what it would mean to be left alone with an enemy or an antagonist on the other side. This is a good beginning. It needs, of course, to be supported in a variety of ways through a variety of mechanisms. There are various proposals about civic consultations throughout the continent, asking people what is it that they feel bad about. Let me now, because the subtitle of the talk is Politics and Democracy in Times of Uncertainty, say a few words about politics. In a famous book, for those of us who are in the field of political science and sociology, a British political scientist, Bernard Crick, wrote a book in defense of politics in the 60s, and then it was re-edited many times. He wrote an excellent footnote to a later edition, looking at the various conflicts, in particular the conflict in Yugoslavia and other conflicts that were occurring, what it meant to have these identity politics resurface in the bad way that they did, the revival of nationalism. And the book is wonderfully structured, and one of them, it's all the defense of politics, and one chapter is defense of politics against nationalism, and of course he says that nationalism is one of the scourges that actually buries politics and makes it disappear. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, in a book, History and Truth, has a little chapter, but for me has been very revealing, where he speaks about politics as having these two sides, a kind of Janus face. One, Ricoeur says, face is the specific rationality of politics, which is the one that delivers the goods to the citizens and the people. And the second face of politics is the specific evil of politics, because politics can be, of course, instrumentalized in the way we have seen in totalitarianism of its different guises. And again, like with history of the good and the evil that live in parallel, so I think also if we want to understand what has happened to us and why it is happening, we need to understand these two faces of politics, and of course work in a direction or incur such energies that will push the elected officials, making them accountable, putting them in front of their obligations and duties, and seeing whether we can muster the energy to actually steer them in the direction of the public good more than their direction, which would be the private interest. The public good, of course, in these days, as we've seen in some of the countries and in my own, where there are authoritarian tendencies in spite of the positive movement of the country which still wants to join the European Union. And having said that, I think we don't need a President Obama giving a speech in Hanover last year, or a Secretary Kerry giving a speech in Brussels reminding Europe what they have and how positive that has been. I think we need to keep reminding ourselves and finding ways in which we need to remind ourselves and all of us about what we have. Some have called it the new narrative. That has been an expression that has been lost. Irrespective of what we call it, there is a need to go out there and to actually say that the danger of losing what we have is a much greater danger than the one of keeping this, while of course trying to reform it. We live in times of uncertainty. Ulrich Beck called it the risk society. We have a huge acceleration of time where people are absorbed by not only their smartphones, but also by the accelerated and greater burden of the work. People simply don't come back home anymore at 4 or 5 or 5:30 in the afternoon, but work very late hours. The whole question of what holds the community together and the core elements of that community. Eastern Europeans have thought long and hard about many of these things. And as you know, we have a Jan Patočka program here, but there are others like Istvan Bibo or Česlav Miloš, just to name a few, that have thought very significantly about some of these issues and that have made serious contributions. I think, and this is part of the intention that we have with this project, is how do we listen to each other? How do we hear each other? Because it is not that ones are the richer and smarter cousins of the poorer and less well-off cousins. If we are serious about Europe and its future, there is a need to go out there. Again, a very small example, maybe not as important as you may think, the visit of Macron to the East European part of the European Union, I think is a sign of that. Much more is needed, and that is why I think Europe's futures as a project is so well placed here in Vienna and Austria and at the Institute, because its history is one of a dialogue, as you know, or those of you who don't know, just to remind you, was conceived as that place where the dialogue between West European intellectuals and East European dissidents would take place. And I think that is why being an institute of advanced studies, such as it is, the Institute of Human Sciences, is a very particular institution of that sort, because it has continued and will continue to bring that dialogue together under this very roof. And a number of our fellows are from Russia, from Ukraine, and from other parts of Europe. And I think that is where we can muster some of that energy and some of the ideas that can maybe then be put forward, or that might gestate at some later periods in time. Democracy, and it comes naturally after politics itself, because politics is that much broader arena where we citizens, endowed with the independence that we have, that was brought about by modernity, by the Enlightenment, by the revolutions, the democratic revolutions, the Dutch, the English, the American, and the French, last in case, where the individual, both as bourgeois and citoyen, came to the fore, freed of the divine transcendence of power, tried to start sorting themselves out. And here, one of the things that I would like to underline, and of course there is nothing simple about democracy. In fact, an author called Colin Crouch already in 2000 talked about post-democracy. We have heard about the democratic deficit in the European Union, at least for the past 20 years. There have been constant criticisms that, in fact, the kind of democracy that we have is a fig leaf for the oligarchic power, that we actually have the corporate power, the fact that we have been in a financial crisis because of the let's put it very mildly, the lightly regulated financial markets of the West, where products such as subprime loans were allowed to flourish, where simply the greed, to say it idiomatically, of Wall Street and all those who belong to that field of activity were let loose. And the result is what we got, a financial crisis of humongous proportions that everybody says has been the worst crisis that we have had. And this crisis, in fact, I think stoked the feeling of people who have felt the huge inequality that has appeared between the so-called 1% and the rest 99%, who at best have had stagnating salaries, or at worst have felt that their salaries have diminished. And having lived in America for 6 years, since the first year that we were there were already polls that were showing that people were saying our children will not live better than we will, even though that was part of the American dream. And of course, that same sentiment has been shown in opinion polls in Europe, and that is what either we as academics or concerned citizens or leaders need to really very carefully think about. Jacques Rancière, a French political philosopher, wrote a small book called The Hatred of Democracy. And earlier, I would say, a more serious philosophical, political philosophical treatise called La Mésentente, the disagreement, that has been translated also into English. It is the fact, and this obviously goes back to Machiavelli in the Renaissance, where in fact the roots of modern politics and modernity are, and that is namely that society is and will remain conflictual. There has been, I would say, an illusion, and part of that is the fair weather situation in Europe, that somehow conflict has disappeared, that somehow social differences, disagreements, the mésentente, is something that is not desirable. On the contrary, it is only with the constant debate, with the constant confrontation of opinions and thinking about the way a community structures itself, the way that dialogue occurs in a society, the way that the representation of politics, the representation of citizens appears, and how it can be mended or even fixed, is an essential part of that. There's a very interesting debate that took place between Albert Hirschman and some of you know a colleague from Germany, Helmut Dubiel, on this issue of disagreement and conflict in society. I would recommend it to those of you who are interested, but basically it goes to this fact that the kinds of institutions that we have and we need to rethink and restructure every day is how is it that we allow these different voices to appear? How is it that we don't suffocate that which would then produce a nefarious effect in an opposition that would lead to a kind of populism? As you know, Hirschman wrote a very good book on rhetoric of reaction, where he basically spelled out how the various right-wing movements, how the populists, and what type of rhetoric they use. Of course, before him, Theodor Adorno, in his authoritarian personality, did that after World War II. On democracy, I think it's important to go further, and two thinkers who have done that over the past years, just to mention them, along with Rancière and people like Claude Lefort and Castoriadis in France, have been Sheldon Wallen in the US. His last book, entitled by one of the seminal chapters, is called Fugitive Democracy. And it looks at the ways in which democracy is not just the institutions, not government, not the deliberations of parliament, but what is it that is the kratos of the demos. What is the power of the people and how is it organized? The other person is Miguel Abansour in France, who is one of these thinkers who came out of that specific French political philosophy school and who wrote a book called Democracy Against the State with a subtitle called The Machiavellian Moment. And of course that refers to the famous book of J.G.A. Pocock called The Machiavellian Moment. The Machiavellian Moment very simply being defined as that moment when a republic is confronted with a challenge to its ideals and its structures. And of course Machiavelli is responding to a critical, tumultuous, uncertain situation. And how is it with wars and enemies, and also coming from a challenge inside, how is it that we try and preserve what are the values, we would say today, and the institutions that we have? And the way that Abansour thought about this was going back actually to the idea of utopia and going completely countercurrent to all those who denigrated utopian thinking and utopian thought. And as you can imagine, this was totally not in the vein of inventing radiant futures of societies, but thinking of utopia in terms of desire. And that is why he found the work of E.P. Thompson, the author of The Making of the English Working Class, which is a book unto itself of how civic energies are created in times of change of the Industrial Revolution, who wrote a brilliant biography of William Morris, the English political thinker and of course member of the arts and crafts movement. And the way in which, to put it very simply, the notion of utopia is thought is that of desire for a different situation, but a desire that is rooted in the contemporary moment, not something in the future or not something ideal. And that's where it's close to Sheldon Wallen's thought of fugitive democracy. It's that energy of the people from below who at some moment simply feel the need that the oligarchic structures or representative democracy or others are not enough and that there needs to be change. Nothing is set, nothing guarantees any kind of success, but that is the human nature, that is the political nature of citizens in the modern age who seek to better the community that they live in and to find ways, and this is the invention of democracy. The title of a book of Claude Lefort is L'Invention démocratique. It is the democratic invention. And to say something, but it needs to be repeated all the time, democracy is a very frail construct. It is frailer than any of the other constructs because it can be buffeted at any time by a return to the dark times of authoritarian, totalitarian, right-wing, populist, etc. movements, or simply by an economic cataclysm of the one that we saw, or by a natural cataclysm. So democracy is an animal, is a construct that needs to be reinvented by us, individuals and communities, as we go along every day. I will conclude by a few thoughts of a number of thinkers, because again, I think that much of this has been said, but we need to constantly be reminding it, because I think there's a difficulty in the everyday life that we have to see that there have been ways out of these situations. And somehow the leaders that we have today are caught in that web of the daily and not being able to think a little further. That is why Macron, whatever we think of him, I think has shown that that kind of forward thinking is possible. Václav Havel, as you know, in those dark times, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And I think that captures it in very succinct terms, that, you know, however powerless we may feel, there is a power in that. And to go back to a period of 500 years ago, a kind of cult text that some call the anti-Machiavelli, but again, Machiavelli is much more complex than one would have him seeing as an advisor to a ruler or an authoritarian ruler, is the book by Etienne de la Boétie, written when he was 18 years old, a friend of Montaigne, and Montaigne writes about him in the famous essay on friendship. And it is the essay on voluntary servitude, which poses the very simple question, why is it that the mass of people do not rise against their one authoritarian leader? It was sort of banned throughout history since when it was published in the early 16th century. It has been a book of insurgency by many, and yet it poses the fundamental question of how a community deals with authoritarian dominance, with domination within its own quarters. I think this I think it's important to go back to some of these texts because even though they are ancient by certain counts, shows that we, humanity, have been confronted with a number of similar challenges of a kind that require what Giambattista Vico called the heroism of the spirit, or to use the ancient Greek word spiritedness or timos. And the spirited person, as is described by Plato, of course, in the words of Socrates, is the one that gives you the energy to confront the situations. István Bibó had a very simple definition of democracy, and that was democracy is the absence of fear. And that is exactly the kind of challenge that we are confronted with. As many of us have said, there is pervasive fear in our societies about the contemporary situation, about the immediate future and the long-term future. And thus, if we are to go by this definition, then we don't really have democracy. If we have fear, then people are living in a different kind of state and are driven by different kinds of motivations. Norberto Bobbio, in his book about the future of democracy, in a sense has a number of similar thoughts. Emmanuel Levinas, the French philosopher, wrote a book called The Humanism of the Other Person, L'Humanisme de l'autre homme. And I think that is a perennial that we must look at. How and when are we capable of putting ourselves in the shoes of the other person? Putting ourselves in the shoes of the AfD voter, or of the Le Pen voter, or of any other voter with whom we don't agree. Not to agree with them, but to understand why is it that someone is driven to a vote like that. And I think that is one of the ways, trying to understand the other, and Hannah Arendt was, of course, one of the key proponents of the understanding that we can move forward. Isaiah Berlin, when asked to give a definition of government, let alone democratic government, very simply put it as to avoid the extremes of suffering. And I'm afraid that through the lifetime that some of us have had, we have seen a number of leaders going exactly in the right direction, not avoiding the extremes of suffering. And it is one's hope that the leaders that we have in Europe that is losing its preeminence, that is confronted with the rise of other parts of the world, and namely of China and Asia, that it has its own long-term strategy of conquering the world. The Financial Times had it beautifully. China, if it can't conquer the West and Europe, it will buy it. And so these are things that are the external challenges. I didn't talk about Russia, I didn't talk about the Middle East. You'll all know it. So it's not enough that we look at the internal workings and how we will sort ourselves out, even though that is fundamental because Europe and the West remain the attractive part of the world. Everybody still wants to come here, wants to come to the US. Nobody's going to Russia, nobody's going to the Middle East. A lot are going to China though today, and that's very interesting to look at because China is offering a number of possibilities. But this way of life, the liberal democratic life based on the rule of law, as our friend Michael Ignatieff would say, that situation when you walk into a police station and you feel that the policeman or woman is there for you and not you for them, is very simply put, but very pregnantly. And those of us who have lived under communism know what he's talking about. Final word, as you realize, Machiavelli is one of the people that I go back to, and for a very simple thought. And that is when he talks about fortuna and virtu, about destiny and capacity or will to act. Yes, we are buffeted by destiny, but destiny is not a given if we have the passion and strength to actually take our fate into our own hands with others and try to define it. That is why I believe that Europe does have a future, at least in the foreseeable lifetime that we have, but we will only make it worthwhile if we are true to the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that we would call solidarity today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for this resounding call to a vision of Europe, which I think here will be largely shared. And I should just say welcome home. We are very happy to have you back in Europe and at the IWM. And may the project be the beginnings for us as an institute to go back to some of the dialogues which have marked the history of the institute. In fact, we had not thought probably 20 years ago that that's what will be needed again, because we had a rather simple vision of progress and history. I think many of us are disappointed with where we are today. And the question is, can we put our heads together to think about Europe's future along many of the lines that you have outlined this evening. So thank you very, very much for this opening talk, and the floor is open.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your question. My name's Aspen Brinton. I'm a visiting fellow here. I'm here to use the Patočka archive, so forgive me for quoting Patočka. He has quite a remarkable essay on the spiritual person and the intellectual is the title of it. And because you've quoted this idea of thumos, or the spirit, of somehow recovering that as part of your vision, and because Patočka himself sees this as an opposite of the intellectual, as something that's not the intellectual, I would be fascinated to hear what you think is the role of intellectuals in going forward through this, since this is the IWM and an Institute of Intellectuals. How do you see them as involved in the future of Europe?
Thank you very much for that question. And many of us who have lived through these tumultuous changes since 1989 that saw the disappearance of a world that seemed to be certain, the world called communism, although those of us who were oppositional intellectuals or simply intellectuals knew that it had an end date. We didn't know simply what that end date was. The end date came much sooner than anyone expected, and thus I can say we were confronted with a situation in which the role of the intellectual is, or rather the intellectual is put before the question, what do you do now? Do you continue to sit in your ivory tower and continue to give your lectures and write, or do you also go metaphorically or really into the street and engage in politics and policy? And many of us did that. I mean, there was a kind of blurring of lines, there was an intersection. The Americans would call that the revolving door between being at a think tank or in academia or then going into the administration, depending on whether those who were elected were of your own ilk. This was there was something, I would say, not automatic, that's the wrong word, but there was something that simply pushed one, if one was of the belief in the ideas of democracy, of rule of law, of human rights that we fought for under times of communism in our various guises. This was the moment then to step up to the plate, because cadre were needed, people were needed to go in, and many of us went into civic activity, into what was called the birth of a broader civil society, from what people had called oases of civil society under these regimes, and then would either go back at certain times or stay where they were. Shalini said, this is my return to a sort of my academic life, which I had foreseen before '89, and that got thrown off completely by the fight against someone called Slobodan Milosevic. That got me into the world of civil society and foundations, and sort of this is a long way to come back to it. So if you look at Tocqueville, for example, writing what he did, at one moment he becomes the foreign minister towards the end of his life, plunges into daily political life, and then writes a wonderful book called Souvenirs, or Memories, which I highly recommend, because it's interesting as a case study of someone who was the intellectual that he was. So I think that there's no precept, there's no strict framework or rule book about how this is. It is largely driven by individual inclinations and passions and feelings of responsibility, and I say responsibility of staying an academic and intellectual in writing, or the feeling of responsibility to act in a Weberian sense also, the ethics of responsibility and the ethics of goal-drivenness. So I think, again, these things have been written about, but and that's why I mentioned spiritedness and timos in Greek, because I think there is something that is this desire to change, the desire to engage beyond the pursuit of happiness, beyond the desire to live your own private life and to follow your private inclinations, which is, of course, the sign of modernity, as Benjamin Constant wrote in his essay on the liberty of the ancients and the moderns. And I think it's a very revealing essay. It follows a number of course, previous approaches, but Benjamin Constant says it's all very well and fine to follow your private inclinations, and this is the conclusion of the essay. He says, but basically some of us have to look at what our leaders, or elected leaders we would say today, are up to, because the danger is always that they will usurp power and actually drive the society in a different direction.
How refreshing to listen again to you, dear Ivan. My name is Mihail Răzvan Ungureanu. I'm a guest of the rector to the Institute. The more that Europe has lost her preachers, the truth is that in this huge choir of dissonant voices, voices like yours, which would in the end put a lot of argument onto the necessity of unity, solidarity, and compassion in a somehow ideological format, would do very good to the new humanism the European Union needs now badly. The truth is that Europe has changed a lot, and I'm less on the side, and maybe this is because of my experience through political life. I'm less on the side of those who say we are doomed. A time of so many questions to whom we oppose just a bunch of answers is very provocative. In a sense, does good to everybody. It puts our mind to work. It puts you and other people to build projects of this kind, referring to futures, not to one future, to optional futures, which is in fact a good omen. The truth is that the generation I belong to, for example, has no memory of the war, so has no memory of the first motivational factor the European Union came into being. And this very gap in our knowledge and awareness about the necessity of the European Union brings a lot of younger generations into the hands of nationalist political parties, which are not, by the way, related to borders, paradoxically, since borders have been dissolved because of one of the European Union main four liberties, liberty of movement, but because of the difference and the new meanings of difference. How can voices like yours, and you as an epitome of pro-Europeanism, can be heard in this very complex sound of dissonant voices? Thank you.
Thank you, Mihai, and it's great to have you with us at the Institute. Well, it's many voices, most of the voices in this room and beyond, that are trying to address these issues in a variety of ways and levels by going around, sometimes like madmen and women in planes and talking at various conferences and trying to spread the word, spread the analysis, spread the dangers that are out there, and yet, these things take time. And I think that's been one of the issues with the countries of post-communism, to speak very simply, and that is that there's been a lag in societal, economic, political development in the mindset of people, and that's why we are seeing elements of democratic backsliding, to speak very simply. Or the fact that, we who have lived in the European part of communism, we were only under it for 45 years, whereas the Soviet Union was 70 years, and that means an additional generation. And so the loss of any remnants of democratic spirit are totally inexistent. And so, as the saying goes, time needs time. And we had many illusions about how quickly this would develop. Elemer Hankish wrote beautifully about it and spoke about the annus mirabilis followed by the annus desillusionis, about the annus horribilis, and simply the realization that there isn't a facade of democracy that suddenly appears after the stucco of totalitarianism falls off, and that it is a much more difficult process. So, colloquially put, rolling up your sleeves and doing what one feels and must need to do, I think, is very important. And yet, I think, and that is why, coming back to the modus operandi of this project, it's really about people meeting each other, listening to each other, focusing, taking oneself out of the daily grind and really trying to understand why the other is actually feeling the fear or feeling that the kinds of decisions that are made by Brussels, some of us may think that the two-speed Europe is perfectly fine because that's the way basically Europe has been. It's been a multi-speed Europe where there have been opt-outs. Various countries have been in Schengen or not. Some have the euro, others don't. And yet confronted now with a serious possibility that the eurozone will take off, suddenly countries are saying either let's join the euro as quickly as possible. The Hungarian central bank director has said, Hungary might join. I just saw that Croatia was saying that it wanted to join by 2022. There are good things in that people feel the heat is on, and that the train, the high-speed train might be pulling out of the station, although nothing indicates that yet. But the European, I would say, those who are at the forefront understand that you need to actually get your act together on a number of things, like asylum policy, like the external border, like the Eurozone, like a possible joint Minister of Finance, like a joint unemployment scheme. These are things that have been on the drawing board for a long time but unable to be put into action. Now that the survival of Europe is also about going forward, not by standing where you are, I think is putting pressure on those who are actually in the lead in their countries. It's interesting again to see, I think we need to repeat this, that public opinions are in an overwhelming majority for the European Union, and very often because they feel somewhat safer that the European Union is safeguarding the institutions. They're less likely to trust their own leaders to safeguard the rule of law, to put it very simply. And I think that in that case, the European Union has a huge burden of responsibility. And to go back to the question on the intellectual or the policymaker or simply the citizen, it is, I think, the task of those of us who are engaged in this work to try and put forth the options and the possibilities and the negative outcomes of certain policies as clearly and transparently to the forefront. Because again, fudging it or just hoping that we will somehow muddle through is not the answer by any chance. And speaking to a number of people who have been talking to policymakers across the European Union member states on migration and asylum policy, these people are simply asking very quietly, how do we sell this to our populations? How do we say that migration is okay at a certain level? What is it that we can say to them that will reassure them? And this one particular person to whom I spoke to recently and who spoke to kind of center-right politicians, center-left and further afield, basically says they have the same questions and the same needs. They need to explain this. Of course, they have their ideological positions, but in the end, they need to get re-elected. And so they need something very plausible in their hands. And this person says on a certain number of asylum policies and others, we have the solutions. The question is, we need these people to come together and agree on some sort of, not even minimum, some reasonable ways in which the member states can come to a joint understanding of what an external border arrangement is, on what an asylum policy of receiving asylum seekers. I take it again as a small but positive sign that Bulgarian Prime Minister Borisov just 3-4 days ago hosted the Romanian, the Serbian and the Greek prime ministers, and they talked about being countries that are willing to work on this issue of a joint external border. The more that these people are meeting, the better I feel. Not that this will solve anything in a big way, but I think that's the way to go about it.
My name is Indira van 't Klooster. I'm a journalist and also a visiting fellow here. I was wondering, you said we have been here before and we solved it, or we got out of it by standing up and fighting for a better society. I was wondering, what do you consider good examples of civic energy that recharge or revitalize this idea of Europe?
Well, I mean, there are fortunately so many historical examples, you know, just to take the founding people or fathers of Europe, you know, who were in prison and were thinking about how to overcome what was the plague of Europe, the wars, and you know, a Spinelli or others, or a Monet, and who, you know, were individuals but came up with these ideas, and then bringing historical circumstance along with ideas, were able to move forward. You know, in all of our countries, and especially in our country, in our various countries of former Yugoslavia, we all joined the civic movement in a variety of ways, and simply I didn't know the first thing about how you organize yourself, and and that's where solidarity came in. We had friends from the outside, from the West mainly, who came in and who told us a few things. What was key was the energy that people had in the society, an understanding that what was happening was very bad and that it would probably get worse. At least I didn't think it would get as bad as it did in the end, but that's again a lesson in history, that it can get very bad. And as someone said, you think you've reached the bottom and then somebody is knocking from below, that you're not quite there yet. So we really felt very deep bottoms, but it was only by holding together, by going out into the street, by speaking publicly, and there were possibilities even under Milosevic's hybrid regime, very small possibilities, but every opportunity was used. And then going abroad and talking to people about the need to help and to understand what was going on. And we were fortunate in my country to have lived the victory in 2000 over Milosevic, deliberately a peaceful electoral victory that Timothy Garton Ash called a rev-election. Of course, I knew that nothing would be easy. And of course, it's been much more difficult than many of us thought. And that the path towards a democratic society in which rule of law is respected is a much longer one than we have. But looking at Poland, looking at Hungary, the way that people are reacting to a number of measures that governments are trying to apply is heartening. Again, nothing is given, and yet when people stand up, as they did, for example, in my hometown, Belgrade, when 3 houses were destroyed by developers overnight on an election night, in fact, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. People came out into the street for days and days saying, this is too much, this is not what is able to. So a lot depends on actually how people feel. And I think the more there has been of a democratic spirit in society, or at least a hope that there could be something, people will try and push in that direction. Again, not always with success, because call it oligarchic, call it authoritarian tendencies, call it the vested interests, call it the underground links between the old secret services and the new economic winners, coupled with, unfortunately, various laundering opportunities of money that come from Western banks. All of these things are more interconnected than we think, and that is why it needs to be the fight has to go beyond the borders of a specific country.
Ivan, will you take one more question?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Ivan, many thanks for your ideas, and also I think bringing in a lot of thoughts and ideas of outstanding personalities. My question is going on the contrary. I think we have an increasing primitivism by the way in which we are giving messages, by the modern possibilities of technology, by internet, Facebook, and. So far, I think the information is shorted. It is making more primitive. And this is creating for also what you mentioned, populism and so on and so on. I think more and more we have short messages. Donald Trump is famous for. Even I think our understanding is moving to pictures only, and not anymore that thoughts are devoted to distinct. What is possible to do against?
Wow, that's a huge question, Erhard, and thank you for thank you for asking it. I mean, we
tweet the answer.
I'll use the new format of 2,000. How many? 280 words, characters. Yeah, that's obviously a key part of this whole subject, and that is the technological change that has happened. Anecdotally, when our son who is now 30 years old, saw an old telephone for the first time with a dial ring. He said, "How do you use this?" So literally, those of us who started on typewriters and went to electric typewriters and now to computers know what we're talking about. I'm reminded actually by a fact that American social scientists have registered that in the, I think, Kennedy-Nixon campaign, the kind of attention time was about 2 minutes. So even then with television, you know, people really couldn't focus that much. So today we're literally down to a Twitter message. What is this doing to politics, to democracy, to, you know, humanist values, to liberty, equality, and solidarity? I can't really gauge. I'm not a kind of Luddite. I don't want to break the cell phone. I use it. But, and so there will be a change clearly in the way that communication is happening. It's already changed, in fact. And the fact that Donald Trump is on Twitter every morning and evening is a sign of it. You remember that when Obama became president in 2008, they didn't allow him to use his BlackBerry. I mean, this is the change that has happened in 8 years. We see with Facebook, we see with the bots and trolls, we see with the way that big data is being mined every instant that we are sitting here, because they know where we are, they know what we buy, they know how we spend, they then sell it to other people. We have accepted, at least most of us, this, well, as some would say Orwellian, others would say Huxleyan world. And I think it's sort of both at the same time. For the moment, political parties, to state something obvious, are still the purveyors of politics. They will, I think, remain for a while. There are attempts at movements, at various pirates parties, at the movements of the indignados of others. They have not yet been able to make a stronger foray. I think it will depend a lot on the key players, at least in our part of the world, of whether they're able to respond to the needs of the people and to listen to. There seems to be a realization that that is the case, and they're going out and listening. What that will lead to, I think it's impossible to tell at this time. And I think it's really unpredictable about how fundamentally the kind of social media that we have will change the nature of politics. But again, and that was the reason of going back to Machiavelli and to the Greeks and to this whole idea of spiritedness. There's something in the human nature, in the human being, this desire to change, this desire to have and make a better life. I'm sure that is a constant, that will remain. What that will lead to and how the leaders or those who become leaders use that energy is really the big question.
So I think it's appropriate to end with the big questions. Thank you very much for opening with your speech tonight the new program launching Europe's Futures here. I hope we'll have you back to discuss the questions with us. The answers are, I think, those which we're going to find together. But thank you very much for being here this evening, and I look forward to seeing you again. And a big, big thank you to you, Ivan.
Thank you.
For
Thank you. Thank you.